All right. Thank you for coming this evening, everyone. I'm happy to see all your faces or not see your faces as the case is. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator for Clay and Owen counties. I love doing our pond programs because I used to be an aquatic ecologist for some time. So I love talking about the different insects and fish and other things that we can find in ponds. And if you're from this area of Indiana, the kind of west central or southwest area, you probably have a pond on your property or at least come into contact with one pretty regularly if it's for something, say, livestock care, or if it's just something that you enjoy. Now, given that we're talking about pond stocking this week, I think most likely a lot of you are going to be watching this because you enjoy having your pond. You use it for recreational purposes, or you may just like having the aesthetically pleasing pond where you can enjoy some nature and hear the fish splashing around. So why don't we go ahead and dive in a little bit here. So there are a few different reasons why we need to be concerned about stocking our ponds. The first and foremost, I would say, is that we have to assume that this is an investment. Stocking fish in pond is not cheap. It takes planning and it takes a lot of foresight too, because you're not only just putting fish in for a season, you are planning for the future of your pond the minute you start putting fish in there. You don't want to lose your money by suddenly putting in fish one year and having them die the next. There are a few questions that are going to be important to ask as you plan your pond stocking. The first I have right here in front of you is your pond newly built or has it been stocked in the past? That's going to determine a lot of what you're going to be doing with it. Another one is that is your pond in a state where it can actually support fish? A lot of ponds may not necessarily be capable of supporting a fish population right now, in which case there is some remediation that may need to be done to get it to that state. Now, I'm going to talk primarily about 4 fish this evening. This is the pictures that I have here. I should also add, these are not my images. These are done through US Fish and Wildlife or through Indiana DNR. They are not ones that I've created or made. The fish that we're going to primarily be talking about this evening are going to be bluegill, largemouth bass, red ear sunfish, and channel catfish. The reason I bring these up is that these are the 4 most successful fish that you can stock to varying degrees. There are going to be some caveats in there, and we're going to go into each one of those. But I guarantee you that if you've been to a stocked pond in Indiana, at least one of these fish has made an appearance. They're going to have been there at least at one point. So I'm going to start with one that I actually grew up around quite a bit. I used to live on Lake Schaefer where there is a lot of channel cat. So I am very familiar with seeing channel cat. I used to go fishing with my grandfather for them all the time. Now, channel cat are a really great benefit for a fisherman's pond. People love fishing these guys out of it. And of course, they make really good fish for eating. But there are some problems with using channel cat fish. The first benefit that we derive, though, I should talk about benefits first, is that they can be easily stocked with other fish. They are not predatory on other fish, and most of the time they'll just ignore each other. So they're super easy to work with, and you can just throw as many as you want in there sometimes, and you'll see them just do their thing. But the trouble is that channel catfish have a few problems. The primary of which is that they have poor reproductive fecundity. And that means that they don't really restock their own population at all. So if you decide that you want channel cat in your pond, you're going to be supplying channel catfish in there periodically. It's just an unavoidable fact of life, I'm afraid. However, like I said, they're not going to bother anything that's in that pond and they're going to work together great. And if you can just keep them going, keep them stocked, then you're never really going to have a problem with them. Now, another really popular and I would argue really important fish to consider stocking is our largemouth bass. Now, a lot of people might look a little bit askew at this one because largemouth bass are piscivores. They're predators of fish. So they might not want to add them into their pond, but there's a reason that you want to. So like I said, they are predators and they're going to be predatory on the bluegill and red ear sunfish that you're going to be adding into your pond. They will very readily eat them. However, the reason you want largemouth bass is because of their predatory nature. They're going to act as a good source of population maintenance for both of those fish species. because sometimes bluegill will very quickly overpopulate themselves and then burn out their own population. Having largemouth bass there is going to take care of that problem and give you that population control. And then it just becomes a matter of a little bit of a balancing act to make sure you have the right numbers of the species. Now, that does come, of course, like I said earlier, with a caveat. If you do not properly monitor your largemouth bass, they will take over the pond. So that means that one of the things that you need to get in the habit of when you're stocking fish in your pond is that you need to fish it regularly to get an idea of your population numbers. Go in there, fish a little bit, see how much of each species you pull out, and keep track of those numbers so you know what's going on. Now, when it comes to largemouth bass, usually people stock them with two strains that are usually available from fish dealerships, like car dealerships, northern and southern strains. Now, the southern strain is one that we'll probably see a little more often in more southern areas of Indiana, depending on how warm they get. Though I would say most likely we're going to see more northern strain throughout most of the state. The southern strain, just like its name indicates, is going to prefer warmer waters and the conditions that are going to be present in the southern United States. And southern Indiana is kind of looking a lot like that these days. So we're probably going to see more southern strain throughout portions of our state. Northern parts of Indiana are probably going to stick with those northern strains. The only drawback there is that they can tolerate the colder waters, but they will develop more slowly. So that's something to keep in mind when you're going through your choices. All right, so a little bit on bluegill. Now, this is another one that I fished a lot of with my grandfather back in the day, and I imagine a lot of you have too. Bluegill make great fish for food, and they're generally a great fish for stocking too, just to have fish be present in the pond. They'll survive fairly readily so long as food sources are available, and we can even look in the water and track how many nests they're making for their eggs. So they're kind of ideal in that sense. Now, they're one of the more popular sport fish throughout several areas in the United States, not just Indiana. And they're able to reproduce easily in a pond system that is healthy. Now, keep in mind that caveat right there. The pond needs to be healthy. If you're starting to get your pond turning green, if you're getting too much algae development, then bluegill development will be in trouble. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you do have that healthy pond, those bluegill need to be controlled. That's where that fishing to monitor for numbers is going to come into place. That's where having those largemouth bass present is going to come into play. So that way you can keep them right at that perfect balance. Now, in contrast, we have our red ear sunfish, which is another fish that's really easy to stock in our ponds. Red ear sunfish, we don't see as often, and that's mainly because we don't stock it as thoroughly as we do, say, bluegill. But it's a good one to stock with bluegill. So that way they're competing a little bit for resources and they're able to live together and just not utterly destroy each other. So like I said, they are good to stock with them and they are bottom feeding. So they're not fully in competition with bluegill. They can reduce the population also of potential fish parasites. That is a huge benefit that you can derive out of red ear sunfish presence. That way you can keep those parasites to a minimum and your bluegill and your largemouth bass are going to be really, really successful. Now, another reason to stock our red ear sunfish is that they make great forage for our largemouth bass. So that way you know that the bass are pointing their efforts to feed in two different directions. They're going to be eating those two populations and not just burning down the bluegill population the first chance they get. Again, monitoring through fishing is a good idea. When it comes to red ear sunfish, if you fish them out, I might throw them back because that way we usually don't stock as many of those in a pond. So that way you can keep their populations going. Now, when it comes to stocking, there are going to be two approaches, and I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. I mentioned earlier that we need to consider that if our pond is new or if it's been recently renovated versus if it is an existing pond with an extant population, meaning there's a living fish population there or it's been there before. And this is mainly these two ideas of introduction versus supplementation. And these are going to have two approaches to them because if we're just supplementing, we want to make sure we're maintaining that population balance as we do so. Whereas if we're introducing, we're setting the balance up as we begin this process. The idea here is to avoid overpopulating your ponds through competition control, through predation, through making sure that there's enough competition for food resources to keep those numbers right where you want them. So let's talk first a little bit about our new or our recently renovated ponds. And when I say renovated ponds, I mean something where maybe the pond had to be hit with rotenone to get rid of a serious pest issue. Or maybe the algae grew so bad that it had to be eliminated through copper sulfate. And unfortunately, the fish populations didn't survive. And you're just trying to get the pond back into a healthy condition. So the best idea here for newer renovated ponds is you're going to begin stocking with fingerlings to raise your chance of a balanced population. That way, everybody is growing together. You want to use 4 species to help develop and adapt to each other. And those are pretty much the 4 species we've been talking about there: our red ear sunfish, our bluegill, channel catfish, and largemouth bass. Basically, you are artificially creating an ecosystem for these fish to start and grow together. There's a really good reason for this too. Let's say that you have a pond and you notice that all of your bluegill and all of your red ears are gone, but you do have some largemouth bass. You don't want to add in bluegill and red ear that are young and fingerlings to a healthy population or possibly an overpopulation of largemouth bass because they won't survive the next few months. You're wanting to keep this balanced. You want things to stay of similar age, and you want to make sure that you're using combinations that are going to be able to work together. Now, there are combinations that are more ideal than others. I'm going to go into fish that I wouldn't necessarily recommend in a pond a little bit later. I'm going to talk about mainly the ones that I've already been talking about. So combinations that are going to work great together, largemouth bass and bluegill are ones that you can't go wrong with. They have their own population control already kind of installed. You can also do largemouth bass, bluegill, and channel cat because, again, channel cat, nobody will pay attention to them. You could fish those out as you want, but generally they're not going to be preyed on. They're not going to be competing for food resources. They're just going to do their thing. And then a combination of the 4 that we've already talked about here, a largemouth bass, bluegill, red ear, and channel cats. Those 4 are able to survive together. We just need to make sure that we balance their numbers out, because as much as I've been talking about food competition, there's also space competition that we want to keep in mind as well. And then this one I've only seen a few times, but it does happen, is catfish only. And there's nothing wrong with just putting in catfish only. They're bottom feeders and you can readily fish them. You just need to keep in mind that the catfish are going to need restocking over time. They will not last on their own no matter what you do, unless you're very, very lucky. But it is very common to see a lot of ponds where someone just likes fishing their catfish out of it, and they will every now and again restock the population for that. So let's talk a little bit about our ratios on this, like I've been talking about that population balance issue. And what I'm showing you here is a table that's being taken out of one of our publications done by Purdue Extension on fish stocking here. And what I like about this is that it gives you really clear numbers, really clear options, and it even tells you the length of fish that you want to work with. So if we get started, we got our fish species here, and it's going through all the same ones that I've already been talking about: bluegill, bass, etc. And then it's giving you their numbers per surface acre. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this is that what I want you to do is, if you're considering fish stocking, you absolutely must have an idea of what your surface acreage is on your pond. Don't guess this, actually try to take some measurements. You can always contact your local extension office too for a better idea of how to take those measurements. You can feel free to email me if you want to, and I can work with you on that one. I just didn't necessarily include it in this presentation. But you could see that they've got some clear information on the numbers that are going to go with those surface areas, and also their length, their age. So working with fingerlings or working with someone who's a little bit more grown. And the one that I'm highlighting here is probably the most common stocking option that you're going to see. And what I really like how it highlights is using this idea of somewhere around 1,000 fish that you're working with when you're stocking. And you can see how they've split those numbers up across that. And in this case, they've got about 1,400 total fish they're talking about here. So we've got our bluegill and our red ear sunfish are kind of balancing each other, where it's 3/4 bluegill and 1/4 red ear. And you can see down there, they've even left a little asterisk of information. The number of red ear stocked is going to be dependent on the bluegill. So you can see a clear pattern where they're talking like, if you're going to put red ear in here, you're going to put in only a quarter of the population compared to the bluegill population. And then you can see that the largemouth bass and the channel catfish are only being stocked at 200 because the channel cat, they're not going to have a big population, but we want to make sure we conserve that space. And the largemouth bass are going to be predators, so we need their numbers to stay down. Now, the other thing that I want you to consider with this too is that you can also use this as a guide as you monitor your fish and you do your fishing. That way, if you go and you start pulling fish out of the pond and you have a rough idea of what numbers you started with, as long as those proportions are maintained from the numbers that you fish out, you're going to be in a safe spot. But if all of a sudden you start only pulling bluegill and largemouth bass and absolutely nothing else, then you know that, well, some of your populations may collapse from the other fish. And it also tell you like, okay, how does the bluegill compare to the largemouth bass? If you're suddenly beginning to lose out on the bass and the bluegill are taking over, that indicates an overpopulation problem. All right, so I talked about this a little bit already. So largemouth bass are going to treat the bluegill and the red ear as their prey population. So they're going to offer control in that. And the bluegill and the red ear are going to fill the same niche in their environment. So they're going to be doing essentially the same things. That's why we stock them in slightly different ratios. So that way we're not pushing that competition too hard. The good thing too is that the catfish, like I said, they're not going to compete. They're just going to be doing their own thing. So you can stock those. And really the only thing you need to worry about are your space considerations when it comes to how you're working with your catfish. Okay, so there are a few issues that come up pretty commonly when we're talking about stocking. One is there's a belief that stocking less than 1,000 bluegill will reduce your overpopulation chance, and that's not necessarily true. It's going to be more about your ratios. A smaller population means that there is less competition and more fish surviving to the next generation. So that means that if you have less competition and your bluegill are able to produce more in their next generation, you are now beginning to push an overpopulation problem, which is why it's so important to monitor and to stick to those ratios as you do your planning for your stocking. Bluegill are particularly sensitive to this. They can very quickly take over because they're very good at competing and they can adapt really easily within healthy ponds. That's why it's so important to stick to those ratios. Now, the other side of this, we talked about our approach when we're talking about a new or recently renovated pond. So let's talk a little bit now about ponds that already have an existing fish population. So we are now going into supplementation. So ponds that have stocked before, normally, I wouldn't say stock them again unless you just absolutely quit pulling fish out of them. If your population has not been extirpated, like if there are still surviving fish, then I think that you're probably still okay. What you need to do is you need to take those numbers, start fishing a little bit. You don't even have to keep them, throw them back if you want to, but get the numbers of what's coming out of that pond. So that way you know where you are sitting. Most of your problems are going to be associated with overpopulation as opposed to underpopulation. Times where that's not going to necessarily be true are going to be those moments where you have a massive algal bloom and your pond turns funny colors, and it's just that is a fish kill essentially. Or maybe you got an invasion of, say, like flooding caused an invasive species to enter your pond and it caused a serious change. Those are moments where overpopulation might not necessarily be at play. But for the most part, it's safe to assume that anytime you see a collapse, one population grew bigger than another and it just took over and they burnt themselves out. So your best solution to this is exactly what I've been telling you. Go fishing and keep those records. I always act under the assumption that when it comes to monitoring your pond, harvest is going to be your best option because these fish, they're meant to be here. They're going to be successful so long as the pond health is there. So harvesting some of them is never going to hurt you unless you really fish. And I've only met a few fishermen that dedicated. Most of them are already responsible about their environment. Now, some other things to be concerned about with an already existing pond are going to be your water conditions. This is going to be really important, especially this time of year, when all of a sudden we have lots of rain, and that's moving lots of nutrients around, and it's going to change the balance of dissolved oxygen and sunlight entering the pond. Fish are going to require three environmental factors for their pond to be healthy and be able to survive in it. It's the same things that we need. They need food, shelter, and they need air to breathe, or in this case, dissolved oxygen to pass through their gill surfaces. A lot of people will treat ponds as though they need to be able to see all the way to the bottom at all times. Well, that's great if you want a pretty picture, but if you are trying to keep a healthy fish population, not so much. So when it comes to things like their food, fish are going to need insects, plants, and algae or other fish species, and the planktonic life, the near microscopic living organisms that are going to act as their food sources. For shelter, they're going to need those plants. They're going to need some chara, maybe a little algae, maybe some other things that we might consider a little more weedy, so that way they can get shelter and be able to hide, find places to lay their eggs. It's also going to be a matter of turbidity and temperature in the water. One thing that I've seen that will kill fish faster than anything is if you shift the temperature of the water by 1 degree at a time when they're not prepared for it. And I don't mean like when the water warms up for the season. I mean like say there was a massive flood event that caused the water to cool or to warm. That's an easy way to kill a lot of fish. In my opinion, if I don't own a pond on my property, I've simply done a lot of research in them. But if I owned a pond on my property, uh, every few days in that during the summer, I'm going to be going out there. I'm going to be looking at its temperature. I'm going to be looking at how turbid is the water. I'm going to be looking at how good is the dissolved oxygen, because there are a few tools that you can buy for relatively cheap on places like Amazon that'll help you take that information. The things that when it comes to dissolved oxygen I have down here, the questions that I ask are what other chemicals, what other nutrients are in the water? Are there things that are going to reduce that dissolved oxygen content, or are there things that are going to increase that dissolved oxygen content? Because what's important here is that the same things that are going to make your fish really successful are also going to make things like weeds and algae really successful too. So again, it's going to be striking that balance and figuring out what to do at certain times of the year. And again, I want to emphasize that if you're not sure, and every pond is different, contact your local extension educator. We will help you figure that out, or we will get you in contact with someone who can help you figure that out. All right, so I promised I was going to talk about a couple other fish that usually are in consideration for stocking. A couple of those that I've seen before in my lifetime are crappie and yellow perch are fairly common choices. While they make good food fish, depending on what you like, they can be a little rough to stock. So both of these species have a fairly high rate of reproduction, and they are in direct competition to your largemouth bass for resources. So what'll happen here is they can do easy overpopulation, and which means that you're going to get a lot of stunted fish out of it. So in general, I don't recommend stocking crappie or yellow perch unless you are really determined to have them. In that case, if you do, I cannot emphasize enough how important your monitoring efforts are going to be there. So if you want to, just be prepared to monitor how their populations are doing and get ready to do some fishing to keep them under control. Now, the last one that I want to talk about is the grass carp. And this is not a fish that you are going to be putting in your pond because you want to fish them. People are putting these in their ponds to control certain kinds of pond weeds. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying these are biological control. I don't particularly recommend using grass carp because the chance of escape is so high, in my opinion. And sometimes while they are supposed to be triploid, it may not necessarily work out because nature is kind of fascinating in that way. However, there are recommendations for them. There are times to use them, and I want to make sure I give you some information on their usage. So like I said, these are used as a biological control for a few different kinds of pond weeds, chara, that kind of thing, and they are commercially available. Now, if you are wanting grass carp, you have to go to a business that is licensed to sell sterile triploid carp. And that when they are triploid, that means that they are sterile. They cannot reproduce at all, period. And that's supposed to make them safe for use in a pond because they'll do their work, they'll keep your weeds under control, and then in theory die off. What's important to keep in mind is that this is an introduced species of Asian carp. So if you have ever seen YouTube videos of someone driving their boat down the river and now they're getting hit by all these fish flying out of the water at them, those are Asian carp. So that is why it is very important, because sometimes in the past, people have bought grass carp and they have not bought triploid grass carp, and they've escaped and are now an invasive species, which is why it's so important to make sure that you are working with a licensed dealer on it. Don't attempt to buy these fish otherwise. Believe me, you are saving yourself a world of hurt. The other thing to keep in mind with grass carp is that they will not eat all kinds of algae. They will really only eat chara or muskweed. They will not eat filamentous algae like horsehair algae. They will not clear out the algae that makes your pond look like someone dumped a bunch of green paint in it. They will really only go after things that have leaves and things like that. So keep that in mind if that's a choice you want to make. Now, in terms of stocking, there are a few rules, and this information comes from the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. They usually recommend a basic rate of about 15 per acre is normally what you're going to want to use for most issues. And then if you are not seeing a response out of that, increase by about 7 fish per acre until you start getting that response, but don't go above that 30 per acre mark. You're also going to have to assume that grass carp is going to take a long time to be able to get the control that you're wanting for your pond weeds. These are living things. They're not like just dumping copper sulfate in the water. They're going to take time. They're going to do what they do because they are a living thing, and it's going to happen on their schedule. The other thing that I want to really, really make sure I stress here is that no two ponds are going to react the same way to any control option, especially biological control. Each pond is going to be different. So I really recommend that if these are choices you're looking at in your future, hire a professional, contact your local extension office, get someone out there who can help you make those decisions. Don't do it by yourself. Now, the stocking rate information I have on here, what they're doing is they're trying to give you an idea of how many carp to put in versus acres of aquatic vegetation. So what they say here is, like, if you have a 1/4 acre of aquatic vegetation, you are throwing in 4 carp per acre on if you're using the basic stocking rate. And then if you have something like 5 acres of aquatic vegetation, you're throwing in 75 grass carp per acre. I hope that you don't have that big of a challenge to what you're dealing with, but that is what the rate they're recommending there. And then they compare that to their 30 per acre, which is definitely the highest you should ever go to, not beyond that. So, and you can see the numbers that they're providing there, though I would say those are really extreme. You're probably not going to run into that kind of issue. So at least you have some information now on what to do with grass carp. But again, I emphasize, don't make these decisions on using grass carp or stocking any fish by yourself. A lot of this should be done with the help of a professional, like a pond management agency, or you can contact your local extension office, and we will help you figure out what's going to be best for your pond. All right, so with that, I've got my contact information up here, including a few helpful links to our Purdue Ed Store and our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. And I will be happy to take all of your questions now.